are the University of Waterloo, and we are built for change. We are researchers united across disciplines and entrepreneurs advancing innovations. We are students working together to challenge the status quo, where leaders connect to the best and brightest talent. We are a global community who drive meaningful, sustainable, economic and social solutions. Through the power of partnership, we unlock new possibilities to transform ideas to inventions, curiosity to action, and imagination to impact. We don't fear the unknown. We thrive on opportunity to create, explore, and push boundaries. We are the University of Waterloo, where collaboration drives the greatest impact. Let's build the future together.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Waterloo Innovation Summit. My name is Sandra Banks, and not only am I delighted to serve here at the University of Waterloo as Vice President, University Relations, I'm also happy to serve as your host and MC this afternoon. We are grateful that you're joining us together with thought leaders on trends and insights relating to the climate crisis, so that moving forward together, we can forge bigger, bolder, and better solutions. Today's discussion follows on the heels of our three innovation summits earlier this year: the Innovation Imperative for building future-ready talent, as well as the Innovation Imperative for building future-ready companies. Our previous summits have explored how the pandemic has exposed the need for a resilient and adaptable workforce, and the critical role that innovation and entrepreneurship plays in driving Canada's economic recovery. These themes are only two of the many intersecting challenges facing us, including the one on our agenda today, the climate crisis. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, governments, industry, and researchers were racing to address the environmental issues we face across our planet. We now have the opportunity to rethink our priorities, reinvent economies, and redesign our cities and work. I want to remind you that we have a whole lot in store for you this afternoon. As you know, we have talented and accomplished moderators and speakers from a variety of backgrounds and disciplines. And of course, we're all looking forward to hearing from our keynote, Tom Rand, very shortly, whose latest book, The Case for Climate Capitalism, will be available to you after today's summit. We will also pulse in short spotlight videos from some of our most creative and committed entrepreneurs whose companies are tackling the climate change. We have guests joining today from all over North America and around the world, coming from the business, academic, and government sectors. You can see your fellow attendees and make connections by using the People section in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. First on our agenda are some welcoming remarks from the President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Waterloo. He's joining us in front of the bio wall in the atrium at Environment 3, the first campus building in Ontario to be LEED Platinum certified. Let's welcome Ferdan Hamdulapur.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Waterloo Innovation Summit. Before we get underway with this exciting event, it is important to acknowledge and pay respects to the elders, past and present, of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. While we are meeting virtually in our respective locations, the University of Waterloo sits on their traditional territory on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations people along the Grand River. As we take the important step in recognizing the keepers of this land, we are also living in a time when we must all look at how we are helping foster a more sustainable way of life. This is at the heart of today's event. The University of Waterloo has a long history of taking on complex challenges, and climate change is at the top of our list. Waterloo plays a unique and pivotal role in the fight against the global effects of climate change. Waterloo is nurturing the curiosity of our students, faculty, and alumni to find solutions to local and global issues. Our efforts to foster a more sustainable world extends to excellence in academics, transformative research, entrepreneurial ventures, and experiential education. In particular, Waterloo is responding to the climate crisis with purpose-driven research and technology. Our researchers and entrepreneurs are creating sustainable technologies, designing policies that protect our environment, and engaging in research that will contribute to a green recovery in a post-COVID society. At the heart of these efforts is our dedication to working collaboratively with government and industry partners in insurance, automotive, aviation, and manufacturing to find sustainable business solutions. Commercialization of great ideas are supported through our creator-owned IP policy and our sophisticated incubator and accelerator ecosystem that ensures supports are in place for our innovative thinkers, some of whom we will hear from today. We know the climate crisis is not going away. There are mountains to climb and opportunities to be found. The University of Waterloo is ready to seize those opportunities. Thank you again for attending today's Waterloo Innovation Summit, and thank you to our host and today's speakers for making this discussion possible.
Thank you very much, Feridun. I want to let you know that as we progress through our speaker panels, there are many ways to stay engaged. We'd very much like to hear your perspectives, and we will be looking to connect and engage with you throughout the program. I want to point out that there's both a chat and a polling function in the right-hand view of your screen, and our moderators today will give you the prompts on how to use each of these. Should you have any technical concerns or issues, please go to the help desk on the lower left-hand side of your screen, and a Waterloo representative will be there to help you. Up next is our keynote speaker. Tom Rand is an entrepreneur, an author, and a venture capitalist with a focus on carbon mitigation. He's co-founder and managing partner of ArcTurn Ventures and sits on the board of a number of clean energy companies and organizations. Tom's first book, called Kick the Fossil Fuel Habit, won the 2011 White Pine Nonfiction Award. His second book, Waking the Frog, became a bestseller in the spring of 2014. And his third, Climate Capitalism, Economic Solutions for a Planet in Crisis, was published earlier this year. Tom is a Waterloo alumnus who holds a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering, an MSc in Philosophy of Science from the University of London, and an MA and PhD in Philosophy from the University of Toronto. Tom, welcome to the University of Waterloo Innovation Summit.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. In a nutshell, if I had one really important point to make today, it's that innovation doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs within a context, in particular within an economic context. And that economic context is shaped by political decisions and ultimately, we hope, the will of the people. And so I want to kind of link those ideas together. Today, you would think that severe and radical interventions in the economy to address climate risk wouldn't be controversial, but that remains a political football. I don't think you have to be a left-leaning Che Guevara fan to understand that today's economic engine is driving us off a climate cliff, nor do I think you have to be a Wall Street titan to understand that some of the most powerful tools that we have in our toolbox to address climate risk are things like capital markets, market forces, large corporations, and so on. Yet, I don't think you could find a more centrist notion than you use those most powerful tools to solve the most pressing problems you have. But that is the beginning of a new cultural divide, which is why I kind of wrote this book. There are those on the left who would throw out capitalism and believe that those very market forces are the root cause of the problem. That doesn't sound, too radical, though, when you think about capitalism itself as being represented by something like a Rupert Murdoch or the Koch brothers, those who use their own power to sort of perpetuate a status quo and kneecap action on climate. So this has been the debate for a very, very long time. Somewhere in the middle of that debate sit reasonable people, professionals, academics, business people, parents, who are tentative with the idea of altering radically our economic system, because small c conservatism, that's how you keep the show running. That's how you build infrastructure. That's how you run social and economic systems. Yet that middle ground where we tamper at the edges of our system rather than get to the heart of it is no longer a tenable position as climate risk builds and builds and builds. So that reasonable gradualist approach, which might have been perfectly reasonable, perfectly suitable 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, is no longer, because that path is now completely unsustainable and it's too late in the game to have an incrementalist approach. So that's kind of why I wrote this book. It's really saying there is a big difference between economically radical solutions or innovations and politically radical solutions or innovations. I would argue that the things I'm going to talk about very briefly today, which I hope we expand on in the panel, may be deeply interventionist and even radical from an economic perspective. They're politically neutral. They have nothing to do with the old debates about left or right. So that's the first point that I'd like to establish. Imagine, for example, as a thought experiment, a price on carbon that is $600 a ton, but revenue neutral, right? So the size of government stays the same. Government never touches the money, but it fundamentally changes how we produce and use energy. I don't think $600 a ton is politically tenable in today's climate, but you can see how that would be economically radical, fundamentally changing capital flows and decisions we all make, but it's actually politically neutral, right, in a way. So that's kind of what I want to differentiate is those two sort of ideas. And it's within that opportunity of rethinking and retooling capitalism to solve climate risk that innovation operates, that innovation has room to breathe, that the solutions we have to solve this problem grow, accelerate, get to scale, create economic wealth, and so on and so forth. So I do think it's important to link technical innovation to that larger picture. And so that's what I purport climate capitalism to be, right? It's sort of a politically neutral but radically interventionist economic idea. It is a rewiring of our economic system using the most powerful tools we have. You take what works, you throw out what doesn't, and you leave your dogma at the door, and I think we can begin to approach this problem space. Look, the left and right have disagreed about lots of things for a long, long time. Right? From a moral framework, the left has always stood for kind of an activist, radical role for government in order to solve things like social injustice, helping poor people, economic opportunity, whereas the conservatives have stood for self-responsibility, incremental change, and so on. And that moral frame has been decided ever since the French Revolution, right? Where on the left stood the revolutionaries of the National Assembly, on the right stood those that represented the status quo, and that's how we've divided these discussions ever since that time. So from a moral frame, there's an activist versus a conservative role for government. From a psychological perspective, the left fundamentally sees people as empathic, right? That we fundamentally want to and identify with other people. The right sees us as self-interested. And that's been the debate on the psychological side. And I don't think either side holds the key to who we are. I think we are complex critters. And I think those debates are good, valid debates about many of the things we're trying to solve. In good faith, these are just reasonable differences about how to make the world a better place. Assuming, of course, that you're arguing in good faith. Some view those on the right as arguing merely as an excuse to preserve their own exalted status. Some view those on the left as being ridiculously naive, and those arguments go on and on and on. But in good faith, that's simply what we're doing. We're disagreeing about how to make the world a better place. Other disagreements, for example, within economic theory, Keynes wanted the government to intervene in economic cycles. Hayek saw that at the beginning of tyranny, and that was a big discussion after the Second World War. These discussions have been about things like the internal machinations of economic cycles, the nature of human psychology, the nature of a moral frame by which we help or establish a better world, and these are reasonable discussions. The climate risk, and I argue, is a meta problem, right? It is independent of any of these frames by which the left and right traditionally disagree, right? So acknowledging, and the left has been very adept at pointing out things like inequality, injustice, poverty, the capacity of markets to treat the environment like an open sewer, the worry about aggregation of power to those with capital, Facebook, Rupert Murdoch. These are big problems. The right has been absolutely correct in acknowledging the role of free markets in unlocking innovation, in organizing complex behavior inside a market economy, stimulating innovation, finding efficiencies. Those are all things markets do, and the right are correct to note that. So from those perspectives, people can bring different toolkits to the table, and we can ask a very simple question: how does your toolkit put a cap in emissions? And that's all we really need to ask for the next 10 or 15 years, because that's really the problem we have to solve in the next 10 or 15 years. So leave your dogma at the door, take what works and throw out the rest. So here I'm just establishing that the tools by which we use to attack this problem are independent of our traditional reasonable disagreements about human nature, moral framing, and internal economic theoretical stakes like the Keynes versus Hayek debates, for example. Growth is where the rubber hits the road. So how one looks at economic growth pretty much captures how one views capitalism. And this is where I think innovation really plays a fundamental role. So people have argued since the 70s, the Club of Rome and so on, that you can't grow an economy forever in a finite world. It's just mathematics. And there are those that there's a Club of Rome crowd back in the 70s. This finite world, infinite growth does not work. And they were laughed out of the room, really, by those who saw innovation, human ingenuity, as a way of bursting through limits. Every time we find a limit, human innovation would come rushing to the rescue and burst through that limit. We saw that in the Green Revolution, for example, when we hyper-stimulated agricultural systems and produced more food than we ever thought possible. And time again, sure enough, innovation has usually found a way to burst through limits to economic growth. And here's how it typically works, according to the techno-optimists. When something gets scarce, it goes up in price. That price signal is a signal to innovators and to the economy to resolve that scarcity problem. So you work hard to find a substitute motivated by your capacity to make money. Lo and behold, in comes the substitute, you burst through the ceiling, and the cycle repeats itself. So in that case, scarcity is playing the role, right? And this is kind of an antibody within the market economy to stimulate innovation and re-stimulate growth. The problem we have, and look, whether the economy can grow forever, I don't know. We'll find out later this century, I suppose. And, if we could dematerialize the economy, some argue, then we can grow forever. Maybe. The developing world wants meat, they want cars, they want air conditioners. So I think we have a lot of work to do before we can resolve what is a fundamental and interesting philosophical problem. But in the meantime, the challenge we have is that we have to replace fossil fuels. The innovations we're building need to replace fossil fuels before they get scarce, right? There is no price signal coming from the price of gasoline that is going to stimulate the kind of innovation we need. So the antibodies that are normally there in a market economy to spur innovation are not there to solve the climate problem because it's a matter of constraints, right? Emissions in the atmosphere, for example. So pricing carbon is one way of sort of artificially stimulating that innovation. So the challenge we have is whatever we view growth, whether it's possible or not to keep going forever, the role of innovation in resolving it historically is not going to resolve it today. That's what I mean about innovation occurring within a context. The role of policy, the role of social innovation and political innovation is to provide the artificial antibodies that spur innovation, not just to exist, but to scale and grow at a rate that matters to climate risk. So that's kind of where I see growth and innovation. Some would argue a price on carbon does the job. 20 years ago, that may have been the case. Look, we don't have time anymore for a price on carbon. It is the most efficient way to do it. There's lots of arguments as to why it's the most efficient. It is, however, incremental. But unless we get a $600 price, it's not going to be fast enough. If your house is on fire, you don't care about how efficient the fire hose is, right? You care about how much water it puts on the fire. You don't really care if the hose leaks. That's the case we're in today. So when we think about innovations in the political side, the policy side, we need to think about how effective it is, i.e. how fast can it lower emissions. We have to think about whether it's politically robust. Will it make it through one or more political cycles? We had a wonderful cap and trade, very effective cap and trade program in Ontario, and it got thrown out on Ford's first day in office. So you have to think about the political robustness of these solutions. So that's where I think real innovation is required in having effective and politically robust solutions. I'll give a couple of quick examples before I stop. We need to accelerate everything. And this is what I mean by technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. So as an example might be, if innovation were enough, every house that I see, every building that I see, it would be heated and cooled by a heat pump. The heat pump was invented decades ago. It is more efficient economically than any other way of heating or cooling our buildings, yet it is not standard in new builds. It is not being retrofitted at any pace that's reasonable and so on. So that's financial innovation that's required. That's social innovation that's required. That's not technical innovation. We invented the heat pump. We need to deploy the heat pump. That's a different kind of innovation. I built a hotel down the road called Planet Traveler. I showed you could reduce carbon emissions in a building by 75%, and you could be profitable doing it. Right? Your energy savings were more than the cost of those retrofits. Every building isn't doing what I did, right? So that's innovation that's required. Even though it's economically viable, the market is not taking it up at the pace that it does. So hence, technical innovation is not enough. We need to change building codes. I've advocated for a green bank where we leverage the private sector capital with a public mandate to accelerate things like building retrofits and heat pumps and so on into the economy at scale. I advocate at a national level, Canada would do very well to think about how we back our winners in this international market. Not pick winners, back winners. Those companies who have the capacity to win big contracts in global markets with tier one customers can get accelerated into that market with the same support structures that we offer our big incumbents, the softwood lumber industry, the automotive sector, the oil and gas sector. There are structural supports for those groups to engage with international customers. We don't have those supports for small and medium-sized enterprises. Last, the WTO. If Trump can walk into NATO and stir up a hornet's nest, surely a motivated politician can walk into the WTO, which has teeth. It is able to coerce national governments to towing the lines when it doesn't obey international rules, and use the WTO as a tool to level the playing field between nations. So that's some innovation at the international level. So there's a lot of detail. Obviously, this has been a very short pitch, but the point I'm making is that the degree of economic innovation and social innovation to get these kinds of policies in place are far more important than mere technological innovations. We need technological innovations. I invest in technological innovations. That's what ArcTurn does, but that's not enough to turn back the tide in a timely manner on climate risk. The rest is social, political, and economic innovation, of which I have a lot of examples in my book. I've given you kind of a quick sampling today. Thanks very much. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much, Tom. Much to think about and digest and bring back to the panel for further discussion. I particularly am taken with the idea of accelerating everything, starting with social and economic innovation. We must invent and deploy much faster than we have in the past. So you've set us up perfectly for the panel discussion that's upcoming, Solutions to Drive Sustainable Recovery. During this panel, we invite all of you in the audience to check out the chat area on the right-hand side of the screen. Your moderator will be checking in on this and will be inviting our speakers to respond to some of the questions and themes that you share in that chat section. It is now my pleasure to introduce Jean Andre, Professor and Dean at the University of Waterloo's Faculty of the Environment. Jean is an expert on weather and society, climate change impacts, and adaptations. Her current focus is on changing and challenging the creation of transportation systems and cities that are both safe and environmentally sustainable. Jean is also chair of the Leadership Council for the Sustainable Development Solutions Network Canada. Thank you very much, Jean, for joining us, and over to you in the panel.
Andrea. Well, this COVID-19 pandemic has certainly created an imperative to restart, but it's also an opportunity for us to rethink economies at the local, the national, and the global scale. Now, as someone who's been involved in climate change research for more than 30 years, I can say that a green economy is something that I and many others have always believed is possible, and I think indeed is urgently necessary. And so I'm really glad to be able to moderate this panel today and to welcome our panelists who bring a great deal of knowledge and experience in business to share with us today. So joining us are Kathy Bardswick and Tom Rand. Kathy Bardswick is president and CEO of the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, a collaboration of experts undertaking independent research to bring clarity to transformative policy choices ahead of Canada. Previously, her professional career spanned nearly 4 decades with the Cooperators Group, including her role as president and CEO until 2016. She currently serves on the boards of Foresters Financial and Wawanesa. Her previous governance experience includes chairing the International Cooperative and Mutual Insurance Federation and Canetix, and serving on boards of the University of Guelph, University of Waterloo, and Metrolinx. Welcome, Kathy. Tom Rand, who most of you have just met a few minutes ago, is an entrepreneur, as you heard. He's co-founder and managing partner of Arcturn Ventures, and he sits on the board of a number of clean energy companies and organizations. He also shared a little bit about how he started a low carbon hotel project. But he's an award-winning and best-selling author as well. And his latest book, The Case for Climate Capitalism, which I had pleasure of reading, really provides clarity on a complex topic, and I would say hope at a critical time. So welcome as well to you, Tom. Thank you for joining us both today. So the way it's gonna work is I'm gonna start with a few questions, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. So a reminder to the audience, you can type your questions into the chat. We'll be having those collated and probably bundled by theme a bit and shared with me to ask the panelists. So I'm going to begin then with a question for you, Kathy. And we're talking about economic recovery, but I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the impacts of climate risk on this recovery. How do we reconcile those things or think about those together?
All right, now can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. Thank you.
All right, I guess I need to be unmuting myself. So first of all, I'll say that, we're wanting to talk about recovery, but, the sad reality is that we're not out of the crisis at this point. And that's evidenced by not only the ugly numbers that we continue to see here in Canada, but globally, we're certainly seeing that the crisis is not over. The pandemic is still devastating countries around the world. And so I don't think we understand yet fully what the long-term impacts of this pandemic are going to be. We focus on death and counts of mortality, but the sheer, I think, devastation associated with morbidity is not yet understood. And that's got long-term, very long-term implications for societies around the world. But having said that, I think that that we are at a crucial point where governments, as Tom has rightly highlighted, governments need to be really thinking long and hard and far more quickly in a more aggressive way with the role that they need to play when it comes to responding to both the challenges but the opportunities as well of climate change. And so we need to stop thinking about this as two distinct silos of crisis or challenge, and start understanding in a far more robust way, more aggressive way, how they're interdependent and linked. At the end of the day, the decisions that we make, and we're all in this together, the decisions that we make are going to be really huge. I mean, the recovery efforts alone, when you think about the devastation that this pandemic has created, are going to require significant amounts of money, levels of investment that we've not contemplated historically. But if we don't think about that within the context of a long-term vision, because we're going to be living with those decisions for many decades to come, if we don't ground that in a vision associated with a decarbonized world, then that vision and those decisions are not worth the paper that they're written on. So I would argue that, we didn't read the writing on the wall when we were heading into 2008, 2009. The writing was on the wall, we chose not to read it. We weren't prepared for this pandemic. Let's not strike three and continue to ignore the writing on the wall associated with climate.
Okay, thank you. Tom, I wonder if you could just follow up a little bit more on the commentary around the pandemic. Have we learned things during this pandemic that might apply to our our climate resilience, our green recovery?
Well, I hope so. I hope the public has a better appreciation of systemic risk, the importance of listening to scientists who warn us of systemic risk, and the importance of the public sector in playing conductor in our response. Right? We changed our behavior overnight. The government, the public sector, us financially backstop the entire private sector in our response. So that's almost a blank check. So I think that's a role that I think the public has seen the public institutions play, and maybe we have a respect for that role going forward. We won't argue so much about that. But I think what's really important is to understand this is the last shot we have to spend money on anything. I mean, we're broke. Like there's the government coffers are bare, and so I think there's actually an opportunity, first of all, to ask the private sector. This is not the first time the public sector saved the private sector's bacon, right? It happened in 2008 during the financial crisis, for example. I think if we are very clear that the private sector, and by that I mean capital markets, big corporations, really owe a debt of gratitude to we, the public, who's backstopped this economic holding pattern and will backstop the recovery, and say, look, you owe me something. And in good faith, I think you should be a partner in good faith at the table, dealing with climate risk over the long term, no more messing around. This is our last chance. And I think there's a moral weight to that ask now that might not have been there before, that the public will hear.
Okay, let me push you just a little more. I mean, different actors have different roles to play, and you're talking about industry here. And I'm wondering, do you think industry is ready to shift their way of thinking in order to sort of build back more sustainably, or to use that as a frame going forward? Are they ready?
Some are. Some have been ready for some time. Those are willing actors, I call them, in this change. Equinor out of Norway. There are some. But no, I think most have to get dragged kicking and screaming. The role of the incumbents, if you sit on a pile of fossil fuel assets, your job, your fiduciary obligation is to try to burn those assets. So we should not expect the incumbents to do anything but be dragged kicking and screaming. Some see the writing on the wall. Some are being proactive about getting ahead of this change. But no, I think they need to be forced through regulations and rules and prices on carbon and so on to play a particular kind of role.
Okay. Kathy, maybe, you've got some windows into how government responds to science and to advice. I mean, what about governments? What is their role in sort of innovating the kind of change that we need?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll share three areas in particular. The first one is, I think, to Tom's point, I think governments need to be as accountable as we want industries to be to get this right, and to be embracing what the future needs to look like. And it's a little bit of, get your own backyard in order, clean up your own backyard kind of thing. I mean, we've built our government structures and our overall governance systems on these silos of accountability and focus, and we're beyond that. Governments have to understand that in order to respond effectively, they've got to be integrating the concept of climate and its interdependencies through an integrated lens. So all levels of accountability is right across the board. Those silos have to be broken down. So I call that kind of getting your own house in order. And we're not there yet. And quite frankly, that's a heavy lift. I mean, that is not something that's easily done. So the level of commitment and understanding and rigor to break those silos down is critically important. My second point would be, and it's related, is that I think Canadians, to Tom's point, I think Canadians are tired of this divisiveness and the lobbing the buns over the wall. I mean, we don't have time for that. And all levels of government have to start working more collaboratively in a more cooperative way, put their big boy pants on and start getting their sleeves rolled up, understanding that Canadians do share a desire for a future that's resilient and prosperous and inclusive. And I think governments share that. They may not share all of the strategies to get there, but stop the rhetoric and the divisiveness. And we're all fed up with that. We don't have the time, the energy, the money. We just need to get on with it. And then finally, I'm going to pick up on something that Tom in his opening remarks talked about, and that is, this concept of governments as enabler and what that means. I think that governments need to really be listening to the courageous voices in industry that do get it. And I'm a little more optimistic than Tom. I think there are champions in a number of our industries who do get it. Those voices of courage need to be listened to. So I would suggest that governments need to pay more attention to those folks, understand the barriers that are getting in the way, and do everything they can to remove those barriers. And I think that's what enabling, to me, represents.
Okay, thank you. Tom, I want to go back to something you said in your opening remarks, and it was about, it's not about picking the winners. It's, you know, I want you to say a bit more about that, but it's really about having winning ideas go forward. Can you maybe elaborate a bit?
Yeah. Well, the best analogy I could give would be back in the Vancouver Olympics. We had our own podium program. And what the government did there was they didn't just pick random people and give them a chance to train for the Olympics. They found and chose athletes who won medals at international meets, had shown their potential to win at that level, gave them a coach, gave them time off work, they could train full time, and we had a record medal haul. We have companies in Canada. Northland Power leads the world in early development of offshore wind, and they're little known here, but they're really well known in Northern Europe. Algonquin Power, Ballard. We have Hydrostore on the energy storage side. We have companies in international markets winning the equivalent of silver and gold at international levels. And I think we need to focus on giving those companies the support they need, the structural support they need, and not afraid of getting behind them, right? There's something very Canadian about spreading the money. Everyone gets a little piece. We were really good at playing farm team, house league. Everyone gets a piece. It's totally fair. We'll all have a go. That's great for nurturing startups and providing a great ecosystem for startups. That's not how you build a global energy champion. You need to get behind those who are showing capacity to win and not be afraid of doing that.
Okay, thank you. Kathy, this next one's for you. When you were head of the cooperators, you really integrated sustainability into every part of that organization. I'm wondering, is there evidence that the companies that do that integrate sustainability deeply into their very fiber, do they outperform others, or is it really a gift to society that they're providing?
I have no question that organizations that really understand and incorporate sophisticated risk frameworks that take into account the writing that's on the wall, and they're prepared to read the writing that's on the wall, do better over time. I don't think there's any question. I think that we're starting to see that around the world with organizations that are sustainably performing and outperforming over time. I think the challenge in Canada, quite frankly, is the point around our dependence on our historic success and where that's come from. And I think that we've got this sense of uncertainty, a lack of confidence. We're not clear. We don't see our pathway forward. So we're hanging on to the certain. We're hanging on to what's familiar because we're afraid to let go, given how significant the role of the fossil fuel industry and its ancillary requirements have played a role economically in this country. When you think about it, in 2012, we had exports, cleantech exports that were running about 9 billion. By 2018, those exports had gone up to about 12. So success, hey, we're doing well. It's a 33% increase. But our fossil fuel, our crude oil exports were still sitting at almost 90 billion in 2018. I mean, this is a huge chasm. And we're running out of time. I mean, we've got to take those courageous steps. And I think organizations that do get it because they have, in fact, incorporated in their fundamental visions and strategic plans, they've broken down those silos. They've made everybody accountable for this new future, and they've embraced it in a more courageous way.
That's a lovely segue because there's a lot of questions coming in about the energy sector. And so I'm going to ask the question, and I don't know if one of you or both of you want to comment, but it's if we shouldn't be investing in energy alternatives, what are they? What would be the useful transitional energy investments that we might make? So I see you both smiling. Tom, you want to start?
Well, I run a venture fund, and that's what we do is we try to pick what technologies are going to win. I think the dynamic that we need to understand is that China has made some strategic decisions. They own solar. they're going to own EVs, they're going to own battery production. And so you want to play with those forces rather than against those forces. And what Canada does really well, frankly, and we still do, is innovate. And so we need to innovate in a way that plays jujitsu with those larger forces that are already in play and make our own kind of strategic decisions. And if I was power electronics, energy storage at the utility scale is still a wide open market. The cellulosic ethanol field is still a wide open market. Software systems to manage an evolving grid as EVs begin to penetrate and drive utilities crazy, that's an evolving market. So we are great innovators. We always have been. And that's what we should be thinking about. I'd make one final note. Look, Kodak owned the rights to the digital camera, right? But they made a lot of money selling film, and their entire culture and ethos and all the oxygen in that company was taken up trying to sell more film. And that's the first thing we need to realize. Technological change is coming. It doesn't matter if we want to argue about pipelines or not. That's looking in the rearview mirror. The examples I gave are things that are forward-looking. It's a difficult job to find out the right ways to invest. That's what we do as our day job. But looking forward and imagining what the grid will look like in 20 or 30 years, it's not the big slice of the pie today that's going to be a big slice of the energy pie then. It's something small today that will be a big slice tomorrow, because that's the nature of a changing ecosystem.
Okay. Kathy, I don't know, you could comment on that if you want, although I have other questions rolling in.
I think Tom's done a good job.
Okay, all right. Then I'm going to ask you to comment on the next one. The next one is really about the roles of government, but not just government as this amalgam, but municipal, provincial, or state and federal, the United Nations and other kinds of organizations that bring assembly of nations together. Like, can you think about or to share a little bit with us about the roles of government and what you see happening at one or more of those levels that you think is encouraging?
Well, in this country, of course, you're seeing very different levels or paces of change going on at the provincial level. I think we all understand and know where there are some significant areas of progress being made in some areas and some geographies, and not so much in others. So, to the extent that we're able to kind of align more effort, more energy, bring the laggards along, that would be good. However, I don't think that should get in the way of celebrating and supporting where the progress is being made. And if the laggards choose to get on the train, they choose to get on the train. Hopefully at some point they realize that it's in everyone's best interest to do so. But find and support those players who are in fact making significant gains. And there are many of them. At the provincial level, that there is some significant progress being made. At the municipal level, there are municipalities working really, really hard on these challenges. And we need to profile them and celebrate the efforts that are underway for them to incorporate this concept of not only risk, but opportunity as well into their decision making at the local level. But they need help. Municipalities own, 70% of the infrastructure, the public infrastructure in the country. But they need help. There needs to be that collaborative effort to be able to support the areas of progress that are being made. They can't do it on their own. We're all in this together. If there's one lesson of COVID, it's that we're all in this together, and we've got to be able to figure out how we're going to contribute to the greater good.
Okay, thank you. The next question is kind of a fun one. Maybe, Tom, you want to tackle it. It's about the Paris Agreement, but more than that, it's about the politics to the south of our border. So it's what you think might happen with respect to the United States' role in the Paris Accord and in other international movements.
Biden will go back into the Paris Accord, but I think that's more show. It's important to set the example. But when America unleashes its innovation cycles, get out of the way. Canada's had the luxury of the last 4 years of being way ahead of the United States in terms of a supportive ecosystem for clean tech. And we've taken advantage of it. ArcTurn has attracted capital from Norway. We've attracted capital from the United States. We've opened up an office in San Francisco, Oslo, because Canada is seen as progressive on this and has built a great ecosystem to help clean tech companies move forward. Biden will turn all that on. And when the U.S. Department of Energy fires up its rockets, you better believe that American innovation system is going to be highly competitive. It's going to be aggressive. They will be backing their winners. They're not going to be shy about backing their winners. That's how Solar City was formed. That's how Tesla was formed. So I think it's great news, but it does mean, the race is on for Canada to get up and defend our piece of that market share. It's great to have the United States back. I think they will be back. They've always been there at the state level, to be fair, but they'll turn the jets on with Biden, I think, and more power to them.
Okay. All right. One of the questions coming in is a bit like what I've asked you before, but one of you might like to elaborate a bit more. It's about the lessons that we're learning from the pandemic and trying to really use those lessons to sort of to push fast on this response to climate. I know we've talked about it a little. I didn't know if either of you wanted to add a bit more.
I want to pick up on something that Tom said in his keynote, and that is about citizens getting it. And finding ways to kind of walk the walk and walk the talk and put the decision makers in these public positions that are going to be prepared, as I said earlier, to work in a more collaborative way to move the country forward. We are running out of time. I couldn't agree with Tom's point more. The US is going to turn on and we're going to be running to try to figure out where our spot is, because I can just see this pent up support for Biden's agenda, and it's at the citizen level, and we saw that, I think, in part through the 2019 federal election process, where citizens were starting to be more vocal about these expectations, and I hope, and I hope I'm not being Pollyannish here, but I suspect that we're going to see an opportunity, assuming we are prepared to not be shy about holding up the success stories, that's both public and private success stories, that generate the kind of momentum within the citizenry that turns out that vote and puts these decision makers in these public positions that are going to, in fact, make the tough decisions and back the right backers and contribute to this broader sense that we're in this together. We've got to move this agenda forward far more quickly than we've ever done before.
Okay. I'm being prompted that we only just have a few minutes, so I'm going to ask one last question, and maybe you can both comment in a little bit. But it's really return again to the sort of the impact on economic recovery. But wondering, can you say a little bit more, for example, on what you think a green recovery might do for unemployment in the country? I know there's a lot of people that are worried about that, or for the GDP, or for other indicators that we traditionally watch to know that we're economically doing okay. Any final comments about sort of the green revolution and those aspects of the economy that we all care about?
Well, the lowest hanging fruit, it always has been, is energy retrofits in our buildings. So that involves the trades, electricians, plumbers, carpenters. You can't outsource that work to China, even though some of the equipment will come from China. It makes everybody who owns those buildings wealthier. It has always been the lowest hanging fruit with the best and most obvious economic upside. I just think we need to find a way, again, social innovation to motivate that being done at a huge scale. You want to put out of work oil workers back to work. It's trades, it's retrofitting buildings. It's the same skill set. And that job is 20 times larger than running the oil sands. Okay.
Final word to you, Kathy, on this?
Well, I would only reiterate that, the status quo isn't going to keep those jobs. Those jobs are going from the more traditional roles, whether we like it or not. So let's get ahead of that and be proactive in the opportunities that do exist.
Okay, thank you. Well, I just want to say that I think this was quite an inspiring sort of 25 minutes. It went by very quickly, but there were three things that I think that stood out for me. One is both of you have said repeatedly, the writing is on the wall, so pay attention. The next one is that we're all in this together. That came up over and over again. And the third thing is that vision will take us forward. So thank you for sharing those thoughts with us, Kathy, Tom. Thanks for being with us, and all the best.
Your pleasure.
Thank you.
have always been at the forefront of the Waterloo community. And one of the best ways for us to share this and bring it to life is to spotlight examples of how some of our entrepreneurs leverage research to help drive the green economy. In our first of 2 spotlight videos, we'll learn about Evercloak, a clean tech startup focused on how industry can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and contribute to a greener future. Let's have a look.
The world's getting hotter and more people are turning on their air conditioners. Air conditioning is expected to represent 30% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So Evercloak is an innovative material science company in the clean tech space, and we're manufacturing breakthrough membranes to help make building cooling more energy efficient. I couldn't find anywhere else in the world where people were able to make these nanofilms in this way. That's really why I landed on this technology to start Evercloak. By being able to reduce the energy use of air conditioning by over 50%, we'll be able to significantly reduce the associated greenhouse gas with those systems. That's a significant impact in the climate change challenges today. So if you look at today's air conditioners, they cool the air in one step. They dehumidify it by condensing the water out, and at the same time that lowers the air temperature. But the challenge with that, it's very inefficient. So at Evercloak, we have a membrane technology that can remove the humidity prior to the cooling system without having to condense it. And so this enables the cooling system to be sized smaller, reducing the energy and the greenhouse gas emissions from this system. I see our system being able to be incorporated into new and existing air conditioning systems. Our main focus is helping to make building cooling more energy efficient, but in the future we have opportunities to help improve the efficiency of water filtration, making solar cells more efficient, batteries last longer, opportunities for smart packaging, so many different markets where our breakthrough manufacturing process can play a role in climate change. I started Evercloak. It was through a national program. It required that I brought IP in a company to be part of it, and the University of Waterloo's IP policy of creator-owned allowed me to much more easily kind of start that company and do that spin-off. We applied for Velocity soon after we incorporated to have the support of the programming here to walk through that. There's a lot of great mentors, and so even from early stages, I've been able to work with them on some of the big questions I've come across as a startup company. So our technology is licensed from the University of Waterloo, the commercialization office, WATCO, as well as we're a part of Accelerator Center program, and so their support as well has been significant in terms of helping us secure funding and their mentorship as well. So I feel very fortunate to have access to so many great resources in Waterloo. To me, Waterloo is the place to be for growing and building a startup. The amount of support in the community from Velocity, Accelerator Center, the university, all the pieces are here. We often get top talent into our company and supporting our growth by being here in Waterloo.
And that was a quick introduction to Evercloak, a leading-edge materials manufacturer on the cusp of creating sustainable solutions for large-scale industry. Entrepreneurs like Evelyn and Alan thrive clearly in an ecosystem that supports ideas with impact. Now let's move on to our second panel, Building a Green Future. This discussion will look at the ways that policy, entrepreneurship, and sustainable finance are some of the necessary ingredients for building that green future. Moderating this discussion is Kathy Bardswick, who you've already met earlier in the program, and who I can remind you is President and CEO of the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. Welcome back to the virtual stage, Kathy.
Thank you, and hello again, everyone. Well, I'm really pleased to be given the opportunity to moderate this panel. And I'll start by a bit of an intro. In light of the need for substantive investment and action to address pandemic recovery efforts, and in keeping with an ever more urgent need to make clear progress addressing climate change, how do we achieve a more successful alignment of the roles that policy, finance, and entrepreneurship play in Canada's journey to a more sustainable and prosperous future? And I have 3 very impressive panelists joining me to talk about that this afternoon. And so let me introduce them. We have Liliana Camacho with us, who is a sustainability researcher, consultant, and founder passionate about unlocking the potential for small and medium businesses to create ecologically, socially, and financially sustainable futures. She started Speaker Sustainability Systems to help resource-constrained organizations exponentially scale their existing sustainability training to businesses, and provide real-time intelligence for creating effective targeted incentives that reduce barriers to low-carbon behaviors. And if that isn't all she does, she's also a PhD student at the University of Waterloo in the Faculty of Environment, working with researcher Sarah Birch to uncover how small and medium businesses use experimentation and design to transition to radically sustainable business models. Our second panelist is Neil Craik, who's a professor at the University of Waterloo, with appointments to the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development and the Balsillie School of International Affairs, where he teaches and researches in the fields of international and Canadian environmental law. Between 2011 and 2017, Professor Craik served as the director of SEED, and his current research examines the legal structures of global commons regimes. Neil has interests in climate policy and climate engineering, law and governance, deep seabed mining regulation, and environmental impact assessment. And he is a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CG as we all know it, and was the co-author of the BSIA-CG International Law Summer Institute from 2014 to 2018. And finally, last but not least, we have Olaf Weber with us, who's a professor in the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development at the University of Waterloo, a university research chair in sustainable finance, and a Center for International Governance and Innovation senior fellow. His research interests include financial risk and opportunities caused by climate change and environmental regulations. Previously, Professor Weber was managing partner at GOE in Zurich, developing credit risk management and sustainability rating systems, and was head of the Sustainable Finance Group at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. So as you can see, we've got three very skilled and capable panelists joining us to talk about entrepreneurship, finance, and the role of policy. So let's get right at it. I'd like to ask you, Neil, the first question. So what do governments have to keep doing, start doing, stop doing, do differently perhaps, to create the necessary incentives and frameworks in support of our transition to a more sustainable economy? What's it going to take?
Sure, and thanks very much, Kathy. It's great to be here. And maybe I'll speak to this more on the level of principle instead of specific regulations. But I think there's really three critical things that governments really need to be thinking about. The first one's really about predictability. Businesses really need to understand the regulatory environment, to understand the kind of investments they're going to need and the kind of commitment they're going to have to make to innovation. And right now, what we see is quite a clear sort of long-term signal in terms of having a 2030 target, having a 2050 target. But what governments need to do is to make sure that those signals are credible. And right now, a very long-term target may not be as credible because different governments will come into play and governments aren't committing in the same way. So we need a sort of shorter-term commitment, probably some 2025 commitments, and some real attention to the accountability of those commitments. One of those, I think, is around carbon pricing. And so Tom and you talked a little bit about carbon pricing. We have a 2022 carbon price at $50. That's clearly insufficient. I take Tom's point about carbon pricing being not the end-all be-all, but still it has a really important signaling effect for people to make decisions around investments, for consumers to make decisions around the kinds of ways. Are they going to retrofit their home? Are they going to buy an EV car? And again, I think those are important. The second area is really around infrastructure. And I think one of the things we have to really recognize is we have to think of greenhouse gases as stocks, not flows. And what I mean by that is it's not the annual amount of emissions that's important. It's the total amount of emissions in the atmosphere that drives temperature. And what we're doing now is we're locking in a lot of emissions with the kind of infrastructure decisions that we're making now. So every time we approve a new piece of oil and gas infrastructure, whether it's an LNG terminal or a new pipeline, or whether we're approving buildings, we're locking in or committing ourselves to a certain set of emissions for 30 or 40 years, which is well into our sort of net zero time frame. And so again, we have to think more about accounting on a life cycle basis, using carbon budgets to sort of think about, when we make these decisions, what are the total capital emissions associated with them, but also the operational emissions associated with them over that 30 or 40-year period. Because if we're spending them there, we can't spend those emissions on other things like building a green economy. And then the final point I would make is just, you can't have a green transition without a just transition. And that sounds like a pat phrase, we all hear it, but I think it's a really important point, because climate policy is distributive. In other words, climate policy will create winners and losers. And if we don't think about how it affects people who are going to not benefit from a green transition, then they'll have no incentive to participate in the green transition and to actually obstruct the green transition. And so I think we have to think about it in terms of regional climate policy, global climate policy, and at an individual level, individual climate policy. Because ultimately climate change, and again, this is being said, it's a collective action problem, and it requires deep amounts of social solidarity. And if we don't start building that social solidarity, then we're really going to have a very hard time, both politically and legally, moving towards a low carbon transition.
All right, thank you, Neil. Olaf, I'd like to pick up on something that Neil mentioned, and that was the certainty that's required, particularly from capital markets and the investment community. So in order to engage the capital markets and have the kinds of financial support mechanisms in place that we need, what needs to be true? What needs to happen?
Yeah, that's the great question, and one proposal that has been done is that the government might create a kind of first loss insurance or some kind of similar approach to help private investors to get more involved into green investments, for instance, just have a kind of first loss insurance or something like that. EDC or BDC could do that to incentivize these investments in the field. The question is now, what we definitely need, we need to have a proactive government so that others can follow. If you talk to bankers, to investors, they are not the one that want to drive addressing clean economy or low carbon economy there, but they will follow. They want to make business. But if you now have a look on everybody probably who is attending here, think about what was the last big energy investment of the government, and probably 90% of us will remember, Trans Mountain Pipeline, 5 billion. So have we seen any other investment in the renewable energy field of that amount, 5 billion? I don't know. I don't know anything. And Neil does look skeptical as well. So I think we don't. So what can we expect? And so what we need is we need a government investment. And there are some reports out. So there's one from the Sustainable Finance Institute at Queen's that say we need about 0.6% of GDP to invest in clean energy and others to achieve the climate goals. So that's about 12.8 billion per year. So that, as I said, it's 0.6%. Currently, we spend about 1% of the GDP for fossil fuel subsidy at any kind. So nearly doubled as much. So, and that's according to Broadband Institute. There's another proposal from Smart Prosperity, the think tank in Ottawa, that says we need about 50 billion the next 5 years, I think. The other one was for the next 10 years. So on the one hand, it's not too much, so it's not that high. On the other hand, there is not even that. We don't see anything in that, and we don't see anything coming there from the government in that field. What can we expect from investors? How should they, as Neil said, how should there be an uncertainty to do? And we see that, for instance, if you look on the fossil fuel industry now on research and development, I think I read a report, it's less than 1% of R&D investments are in renewables. All the rest is still in the old conventional fossil fuel. So we don't see, it's very hard to find conventional investments in the renewable energy and carbon reduction technology, other than people like Tom Rand and colleagues that are dedicated to do that. But we need the money coming from kind of conventional investors, and not only from those that are proactive drivers in the field. So I think we need some instruments that the government can offer to support the financial industry. Sustainable Infrastructure Bank has been mentioned as well. I think that can do some investments, and that's on the one hand. So we need these types of instruments. On the other hand, we really need to think about where do we want to spend, the tax money. Also, and especially now after COVID, there will be much money spent. So do we want to continue to put it into the fossil fuel industry? Do we want to change into other industries? But again, and I want to finish with that. We should not see this as a provincial problem. It's not a problem of the oil sands of Alberta. It's a national problem, I think. So we want to achieve the goal. So we all have to do something for that, and we cannot just say, we lived for decades from based on oil. We had a good income, and now we don't care anymore. So we have to figure out what to do on a national level. Thank you.
Oh, my mic. Okay, sorry. Liliana, I'd like to bring you into this. So we've heard what the financial markets may need and what government policy may need. But I'd like to hear your perspective, given how critically important small and medium enterprise is. What kind of support mechanisms do small and medium enterprises need if we're going to have them play the significant critical role that they need to play in the transition?
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. So small businesses and medium businesses are, in my opinion, very important. In particular, in Canada, they comprise more than 90% of the Canadian economy. So their Canadian business is small business. And if we think about the kind of transition that we need, we need a transition that is very different in terms of supporting social outcomes, environmental outcomes, and addressing the kinds of cracks in our system that the pandemic really made visible. So from my perspective, in addition to sectoral regulations, we need investment in policy and private and public collaboration that supports sustainability entrepreneurship. So what that would look like, for example, in terms of policy, as a number of panelists have already suggested, real consequences for noncompliance. Like there needs to be much more accountability, and as an entrepreneur, we need some degree of certainty in terms of, there will be a risk to my business if I don't act in a low carbon way, if I don't put into practice some resilient models and practices. And the fact, if getting more stringent over time means that I understand that my risk will be increasing, so I am more encouraged to act proactively. And if I'm proactive as an entrepreneur, I have the opportunity to create different forms of value, such as social value or environmental value early on, and capture that in the market. As another example, there are some countries that have created a new form of corporation that's a social business. So social businesses benefit from tax incentives or special grants. They are different from nonprofits, and they are different from for-profit corporations. And so that's another signal that the government could send to the market to suggest that there's new kinds of value that will be rewarded. And it's a way of changing the competitive landscape. I think also in terms of collaboration, I would like to see more ecosystems, and the way that the University of Waterloo has set a really good example in this. These are ecosystems, networks that support this kind of sustainability entrepreneurship. From the incubators play a coaching role, an education role, educating entrepreneurs on what a sustainable business model might look like, on what sustainable practices look like, investors who understand how to assess environmental and social impact and can prioritize environmental and social impact in addition to financial return, and a focus on municipalities, this deep integration with the community, because small businesses in the community are kind of they touch grassroots innovations. They touch the cracks in the system. They see issues that arise and are able to respond to them. And then alluding to Tom's point before, a way to connect local innovation in the ecosystems to government backing, to support those proven winners, and really providing a catapult for the most sustainable, the most promising solutions. And then I think an ecosystem like this can also support medium-sized businesses as well. Like, I don't want to just focus on entrepreneurship. Medium-sized businesses need peer learning. They need opportunities to understand other actions that they can integrate into their business. A lot of medium-sized businesses have already taken really promising steps, and they're looking for more, for how to go deeper. And change management support. They have to transition a handful, a few hundred employees to a new way of doing business, and so that takes real leadership, and that takes real intention.
Okay, thank you. Olaf, I want to follow up on Lilianne's point about some of the learning in other countries. Are you seeing perhaps approaches or success within the capital markets, or the role of more creative financial instruments in other parts of the world that Canada should be learning from?
Yeah, sure. Globally, for instance, the amount of green bond issuances are skyrocketing. So every year we have many more green bonds. Canada started to do some as well. There are some issuances of green bonds. Some of the banks did, and Municipality of Ottawa did, EDC or Ontario, but it's still relatively low. So that's an opportunity where we can learn from other countries. The same with addressing the whole topic, with regard to financial sector risks. Just I think last week there was this announcement that Bank of Canada and OSFI, so the Ontario regulator, will collaborate in developing climate scenarios for the financial industry. This as well. So this is much more advanced than many other countries. UK has the first report, for instance, on stranded risk and how the industry is affected by that, and what could be alternatives for them as well. We see other countries. China has a green credit policy, for instance, that increased the amount of green lending significantly, and that's the good news, and also reduced the financial risks in this country. So there are these different regulations. The European Union has a green finance legislation set up as well, and so I think there are many examples in other countries, and I would really advise that we try and have a look what they do instead of inventing the wheel again. So I think there are so many different good ways to invest in renewables, to invest in clean tech, that we can copy from others, that we do not have to come up with our own probably perfectly tailor-made solutions for Canada. It's not that different from other countries.
We like to think we're so different, right? But we can't learn from others. So just picking up on that for a bit, and again, Liliana had referred to, organizations that are being successful and need some additional support and backing, and she talked about ecosystems. Neil, should governments be backing winners? What's your view of that?
Well, I think the same as the others. Perhaps not on a technologically specific or firm-specific level, but what governments need to be doing is creating an environment for successful firms to be successful. And I think one of the primary areas, and we're seeing this a bit in COVID, is direct support for upstream research. And so there's really weak incentives for basic science, which is absolutely critical for innovation, and probably weak incentives for even sort of slightly below that, but sort of pure innovation science, the kind of stuff that universities do, which I know sounds self-serving, but I think also industry. And I think really focused research, sort of mission-driven research. And I think we keep talking about things like climate emergencies, But really, I think governments have to start being much more strategic, much more focused in how they're doing this. We really do need to take a sort of national stock taking about what we're good at, what we're not good at, where our innovations are likely going to come from, what the investment environment looks like in Canada, and start developing policies along those lines. One of the things we're also not doing is we're not having some really fundamental debates, I think, around technology and around the kind of world that we're going to be moving to. We're talking about being net zero emissions. And net zero emissions means not only reducing emissions, but also taking emissions out of the atmosphere, which really requires a radically different kind of set of technologies that are quite controversial. And again, I think thinking about the public acceptability of those, the kind of range of climate responses that we need. And so again, I think government's got a really strong role to play in creating the environment for innovation, for paving the way. And I think that the private sector, if it's given those tools, that's really where they can flourish. And to some extent, government can get out of the way and not worry about having to pick winners, which we know government hasn't been very good at.
So Liliana, let me ask you kind of a similar question in terms of the picking winners or backing winners, but more to a bit of a different slant. I mean, you're in the space, you're helping small and medium enterprise to think through how they bring their entrepreneurship to life. What would be your number one ask? Is it to pick winners and to create a more focused ecosystem for those winners, or is it something different? What's your number one ask?
I would say, can I have two asks? I think a clear direction is really important, and the idea of really backing a mission of environmental and social sustainability. So this has to be very clear for entrepreneurs if we expect them to start generating that kind of value. Otherwise, the landscape is still a financial competition. And if I, as a sustainable entrepreneur, try and enter that competitive landscape, eventually I'm going to be forced to be making decisions based on my finances alone if I want to be competing. So if we have a clear, a clear mission, a clear direction in terms of Canada wants to be more sustainable, our businesses have a role to play in reducing emissions. We have a certain emissions target we're working towards, and we have finance, like investors who are prepared to support environmental and social businesses. Then I think we have a pathway for success. And the second thing is this idea of linking the small proven entrepreneurship to larger scale investment and larger scale support. And as Tom was saying, Canada can play a large role internationally if we have great solutions that we come up with here in the Canadian ecosystem, support to be exporting that and leading the way.
Okay, well, thank you very much. What I'm hearing, and I think we need to wrap this up now, what I'm hearing is alignment is going to require this shared sense of priority and ensuring that we're not trying to be everything to everyone, that there is some understood and defined framework within which policy is set, within which capital markets have some of the certainty and the opportunity to respond to, and within which the small and medium enterprises and the entrepreneurship that needs to be brought to these challenges and these opportunities is understanding the ecosystems within which they are working. So you've all taken it from a different perspective, but arrived at an aligned message for all of us. So I want to thank you very much. I found this very, very interesting. Bringing your respective perspectives to the challenges that we face. And I will turn it over to Sandra.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And also thank you to Liliana, Neil, and Olaf for bringing the discussion around building a green future very much into sharp focus and giving us a lot to think about. Let's take a minute and turn our attention to our second spotlight video. This time we'll hear about Agrisea. The founders of Agrisea relocated from the United States because they were attracted to Waterloo's innovation ecosystem. This startup is looking to disrupt agriculture while feeding our Earth's population. Have a look.
We believe in a future that is sustainable and use our resources sustainably. If you're doing agriculture, you need these set of things: freshwater availability and land. Those two things have confined agriculture for the past 10,000 years. In a large way, it's been restricted by our own imagination to think that those resources are our only ways of being able to grow our crops. Agrisea wants to break that mold. This idea can really reform the entire agricultural system to be completely free from those two constraints. And what we saw was that you can actually find that in the oceans, and particularly in coastal areas. You have enough nutrients and water flow to be able to actually support life there. So it's 20 times cheaper than being able to grow on land. We focused on rice because it feeds over half the world's population at 3.5 billion people. If you look at organisms like mangroves or seagrasses, they have this particular set of genes that is highly efficient to be able to manage soil. This set of genes we found actually exists in rice. Where these genes are normally dormant, they're not switched on, we can go and switch them on to the right levels, the right location, and with that you can create a oceanic salt-tolerant crop in rice that would otherwise normally grow exactly in soil. Rice is one of the worst producing crops out there for methane. We believe the technology that we're doing can disrupt that entire industry to be more sustainable by being able to use no fresh water, no land, and no chemical fertilizers. And being able to do that will drastically change how we produce food in the future. And I have absolutely no doubt that in a couple of years, you will be looking out across floating ocean farms on almost every coast. One of the toughest things when you're trying to grow a company is to get investment. But to do that, you need to have a very secure intellectual property portfolio. And being in Velocity and with the University of Waterloo, all our IP is ours. For any company, that really is just a comfort. There's so much availability of equipment here, support from the actual team itself, some of the most advanced equipment you can find on the planet. For us, that's just so valuable to grow our business that can join the top agriculture companies in the world. We don't want to compete with them. We want just to build a world that is better, that is more sustainable, that preserves our resources as we grow both as a population and as an ecosystem.
And to quote the video, build well better, a great theme to think about as we just begin to wrap up the summit this afternoon. We've heard today that ideas, passion, science, and finance can come together to innovate climate change solutions and support both our climate and have economic payoffs. When I think about the two panels, our keynote speaker, the contributions from our very talented moderators, 3 or 4 themes come to my mind. The first one is the indelible impact of time. And to quote Jean Andre and others, the writing is on the wall. We must learn from crises of the past and today's COVID-19 pandemic to move quickly. We have no time to lose. There is obviously a key role in this response to the climate of the public sector. Lots of discussion around that because the innovation that's required is social, political, and economic. And while Canada has been a very progressive player when it comes to clean tech and green tech, we know that the US is about to unleash its innovative potential and market clout. And as another speaker pointed out, the public sector must also be involved because it's not just a green transition, it must be a just transition. And when it comes to the private sector, obviously there's a huge role for large and small companies. We heard that there are many champions in the private sector who have already acknowledged the importance of integrating sustainability into their operations, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because there's actually a market payoff for doing so. We also heard that small and medium enterprises, based on their sheer volume alone, are critical contributors to our climate solutions, both in terms of supporting the ecosystems where they grow, giving clear signals about the ability to support social and sustainable solutions, and to make sure that there are connections between these small entrepreneurs and large-scale enterprises. And maybe the final message is that Canadians, in addition to time running out, so is our patience, and that we are looking for more collaboration and more cooperation from all sectors. So with that, I think we're very close to the end of our formal program. I'd like to thank our summit speakers who have been outstanding, and to each of you in our audience for joining us today and participating in this very important discussion. The Waterloo Innovation Summit brings together industry, researchers, and government leaders to inspire innovation, collaboration, and ultimately change. Following today's event, in fact, early tomorrow morning, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to your complimentary copy of Tom Rand's book, The Case for Climate Capitalism. And as well, a recording of today's summit will be available on the Waterloo Innovation Summit website later today. With that, let me formally bring to a close this edition of the Waterloo Innovation Summit. Thank you for joining us, and do have a great rest of your day. Thank you.